Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are at the moment. I welcome you very much to session number 2 of our webinar series with topics relevant for owner and shipping clients and managers around the world. We are talking today about offshore wind energy and the impact on the maritime industry. My name is Finnern. I'm a maritime partner in the Hamburg office of WFW. So today, we want to have a look at following topic. In Europe, we are seeing a sort of a second wave of investment into the offshore wind market, with countries such as Italy, Greece, and Poland getting involved. In Asia, you see countries as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, also looking to significantly grow the proportion of its power portfolio generated by renewables. And of course, you have the US. In the US, the new administration is looking to significantly grow the percentage of energy generated by renewables, whereas the previous administration was more married to fossil fuels. So in the US, there are ambitions to build up similar capacity as Europe. According to one source we listened, it's around 500 vessels required to meet that goal. So mainly about wind turbine installation vessels, as well as operation and maintenance vessels. Depending on the estimate, there might be a dozen to 20 currently. So that is a topic we have to look at. Wind farms are much further out to sea because technology allows, the winds are stronger, so generally less of an issue with resource consent. So much larger, and so that is the topic we, out of our practice, see much more interaction. So we will learn today more about investments in that field and the significant impact they have, driven, for example, by tax aspects. In the US, it seems to be on a state-by-state level, but also on a more federal level. But of course, my colleagues Daniel and Chris will, of course, tell us a bit more. The technology, as mentioned, is much more complex, new designs, new engineering. So we will hear a bit from Chris and Dan on, in particular, the structure for that, and of course, bankability. Daniel is a partner in the tax and regulatory group based in New York. So he focuses on US tax aspects and cross-border transactions, as well as sanctions. So he has experience in structuring transactions, minimizing withholding tax, anti-deferral regimes, as well as FATCA advice. So Daniel helps clients analyze the US freight tax on shipping income, as well as exemption from tax. Daniel's sanction experience, including advice to clients in understanding and complying with the rules and regulations of the Department of Treasury Office, Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, as well as pension law. He will, together with my partner, Chris Belisle from the finance group in New York, tackle the topic. So Chris is primarily active in the maritime aviation sector with advising and loan facilities for ships, helicopters, and lease financings. He has also extensive corporate experience, including advising in relation to joint ventures, strategic alliances, and on acquisition, disposal, and restructuring of companies, in addition to company filings and commercial contracts. He has also background and experience as a litigator in commercial litigation, securities, swaps, derivatives, and representation of creditors in insolvencies. So, Daniel, Chris, of course, thank you very much for giving us an insight. And I now hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Christian mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about offshore wind, and then my partner, Chris, will talk more specifically about the maritime aspects. But I'll be talking about offshore wind. What is it? How does it work? How is it financed? And I think it's important to note or to remember that in many ways, offshore wind is similar to onshore wind, is similar to a traditional power plant, is similar to any other major project finance construction project. You have the parties, developers, suppliers, service providers, off-taker, and the financing. And so I just wanted to start by taking a minute and talking about the various elements to an offshore wind farm very briefly. So first, perhaps the most salient aspect is, of course, the turbines. There's a picture of one on the right of this slide, big offshore spinning wind turbines that harness the power of the wind and convert it into energy. They're installed on the seabed. You also have the balance of plant, which is essentially everything except the turbines. That includes transmission assets. You have long-term operation and maintenance contracts. This is important in any power plant, but it's particularly important in the case of offshore wind. And the reason is, in addition to the ordinary wear and tear that you might have in an onshore plant, you have all the sea and salt water and weather-based erosions and problems in offshore wind. And here you really do see a little bit of tension between some of the relevant parties, where you will often have for the lenders and for anyone else who's really looking for a fixed income stream, you want to lock in the O&M costs as much as possible and have a long-term fixed contract. Whereas for any equity investors or for the developer, this might be an area where they might want to have more variable costs to allow them to cut costs and thereby increase their return. You also have grid connectivity. You need to be able to connect your power plant to an onshore grid to transmit the power that you generate. You need to have some sort of off-taker arrangement. This is most typically a power purchase agreement or a PPA, where you have a long-term contract with either a corporate buyer or a governmental entity, which agrees to buy the power that you generate. Now, this can be either fixed price, so you set the price right now, and then regardless of the price of energy going forward, the price remains the same. Or perhaps more frequently, what we see is a floating rate agreement where the price goes up and down based on the market price of power. But then to create stable cash flows, you couple that with a hedge essentially, where you hedge your exposure and you make sure that you have stable cash flows. And then we have issues relating to permitting and water rights. And finally, certainly in Europe and in some other places, you have a green certificate. You have a certification that this is indeed environmentally friendly power. So that's what wind farms are. Now, how are they financed? Several ways. Probably the most basic and simplest form of project finance is a traditional bank loan. Here you have a bank lender making a loan to the actual project company. The lender will have security over both the project assets, including the turbines, as well as any contracts. And the theory is if there's an event of default or if something goes horribly wrong, the lender can essentially take over the project and continually running the project and recoup its investment. You sometimes have a project loan for the entirety of the project. Sometimes it's just for the construction phase or just for a brief period, and everything in between. In certain cases, a loan can be backed by an export credit agency. So for example, you might have an agreement where you're going to purchase wind turbines produced in factories in a certain country, and that country's ECA provides a guarantee of this loan to help facilitate the transaction and thus help that country's economy by producing and selling these turbines. And then finally, one interesting aspect that you have in the case of a wind farm that you don't have in the case of a traditional power plant. So in a traditional power plant, you have the construction phase where you're not operating, you're just spending money. And then once the power plant is complete, you switch it on, you start generating power. In the case of a wind farm, as soon as your first wind turbine is installed and connected to the grid, you can start generating electricity and therefore generating revenues during the construction phase. So you then have a question, well, who gets the benefit of those pre-completion revenues? And here too, you have a bit of tension where often the lenders will want either some sort of special cash sweep to make sure the money goes to them, or some sort of cash reserve to make sure that that this money doesn't just go up and go up to the investors. Alternatively, of course, the investors would prefer to get the benefit of these pre-completion revenues. So that's a project loan. You also have, very frequently we see what's called back leverage or mezzanine debt. And the difference here is that the loan isn't made to the actual project company. The loan is made to an upper tier company above the project company level. So the downside, the disadvantage, is that you don't actually have security over the project assets. If there's a major event of default, you won't be able to directly to take over the project. But on the other hand, as long as the project is relatively bankable, you have stable expected cash flows, and you can, while not eliminating the risk, you can certainly minimize the risk. And we certainly see a lot of lenders who do make these back leverage loans with the understanding that because they have more risk, they'll get a higher return. And then, of course, we have U.S. tax equity, and that's what I'll be spending the remainder of my time on. So tax equity is a very important aspect of U.S. Both offshore and onshore wind. In some form of tax credits have been in place for many decades, but the current structure was mostly put into place in the 2000s, about 15 years ago. And essentially, there are two types of credits. There are production tax credits, where you get a tax credit for the electricity produced. And then you have an investment tax credit, or an ITC, where you get a credit based on the upfront expenditures. So the PTC, you're really getting the credit over the life of the project. As the project produces energy, that's when you get the credit. In contrast, the ITC, you really just get, it's front loaded. You get the credit at the beginning. What we tend to see is, because offshore wind is so capital intensive, we tend to see ITCs used more frequently, where the parties really want that upfront credit as opposed to the long-term credit for energy generation. One feature of the tax credits that has long been the case is, for various budgetary reasons, they are frequently phased out and expire. And then there's always a scramble at the end of the year when they're about to expire, and then the expiration date is pushed out with continued phase outs, et cetera. For the past several years, what I think the wind energy really anticipated was that 2020 was going to be the year where they finally completely expired. What we saw was that did not happen. We continued to have an extension. And what that means is that under current law, the general rule is that both PTCs and ITCs, while reduced, continue to be in effect for projects that begin in this year, in 2021. Under current law, those are scheduled to expire, although, of course, there is every reason to expect, or at least anticipate, that this will be extended further. But then there's one other important aspect to offshore wind. So as part of the flurry of legislation at the end of last year, what we saw is that for offshore wind, not onshore, but offshore wind, the ITC was extended for construction begun through 2025 with no phase out. So full ITC through 2025. So what we really see there is, first of all, a differentiation between offshore and onshore wind, and appreciation that there's a lot of appetite for very much ramping up and supporting the offshore wind industry, and it is seen as a growth, very much a growth industry in the United States. Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon is the chair of the House, of the Senate Finance Committee, rather. And he has proposed a bill, and because he's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, that means he's the main tax writer in the Senate, and that's why his bills tend to attract a fair amount of attention. Essentially, he would once again continue to extend both the PTCs and the ITCs, but unlike in current, unlike in what we've seen traditionally, the phase out would not be based on a specific number of years. It would be based on targeted reductions in greenhouse gases from the U.S. power sector, which is part of the main reason, of course, why the U.S. government is interested in promoting offshore wind. Everything that I just talked about was credits. The other important aspect of tax equity is depreciation deductions. What we now have is bonus depreciation through 2027 with a phase out period. So essentially, for everything you don't get the credit for, you get a 100% deduction of all your costs gradually being phased out. Even if that is phased out, which is certainly possible, what we would expect is this will still have significant tax benefits because due to accelerated depreciation, even if there's no more bonus depreciation. So that's the law, and that's how the credits work. How do the structures work? Well, what we see is you have you have different incentives where the tax equity investor really, they're doing this, they're making their investment because they want the credits, they want the tax benefits, but they don't want the long-term ownership of a wind farm. That's not their business. In contrast, that is what the developer wants. So what we often see is this flip structure where, at least initially, everything, income, deductions, credits, etc., everything is allocated 99% to the tax equity, 1% to the developer. So the tax equity gets the vast majority of their benefits. And then after some metric, after the credits have been claimed, after the return has been reached, you have a flip where now the tax equity gets only 5% and the developer gets 95%. So each party really gets what they want. And then there's typically a purchase option to take out the developer's interest, which is typically exercised. In 2007, the IRS explicitly blessed this structure for wind PTCs. They did not similarly bless ITCs, so there's a bit of a question there. But certainly people are relying on this guidance as well as case law and other provisions to adopt similar structures for offshore winds and for ITCs. With that said, one cautionary note: there's this very important Third Circuit case from 2012, Historic Boardwalk Hall. This case involved not wind credits, but historic rehabilitation credits, but the issues are very similar here. And in this case, the tax equity investor essentially got a little bit too greedy. And what the court found was that the credits and the return were effectively guaranteed. There was no meaningful downside risk, and therefore they were denied the credits on the grounds that this was not a genuine partnership relationship. What that means is essentially it's very important to pay very close attention to the guidance and make sure that the tax equity investor does indeed bear the risk of not getting the credits. Thank you. I will now turn it over to Chris.
I've been asked to discuss U.S. cabotage rules, commonly known as the Jones Act coastwise trade laws in the United States, as they relate to the offshore wind industry and the expected boom in wind farm installation in the near term. The underlying purpose of the Jones Act is to ensure that the United States has a fleet of suitable vessels built and maintained here, I'm in New York, in the United States, and owned and operated by United States citizens to satisfy commercial, defense, and national emergency response needs. The Jones Act coastwise rules and regulations require the transport of merchandise, which I'll get into later, and passengers under a different law than the Jones Act, but everybody still refers to it as one, between U.S. points, and all those transportations must be conducted on U.S. flagged ships owned by U.S. citizens. Renewable energy has become a cornerstone of our new administration's Build Back Better plan. And in his joint address to Congress last month, President Biden said, quote, "There's simply no reason why the blades and wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. For the offshore wind industry, there was one unstated corollary. No matter where those blades were built, if they are to be transported from a point in the United States to an installation at an offshore point within the United States, they have to be transported on vessels built here, not necessarily in Pittsburgh, and they must be owned and operated in a manner consistent with the Jones Act coastwise trade laws." Coastwise trade in the United States applies to the transportation of merchandise, which includes any goods, even merchandise without any value, between U.S. points. The word point is used, not just ports, because it encompasses not just off-take or on-take facilities or any other port, but points within the jurisdictional waters of the United States. That generally extends out 3 miles, but under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the Jones Act was extended to the Outer Continental Shelf of the United States. By some estimates, over 1,500 turbines are expected to be installed off the east coast of the US over the next decade. Before 2020, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act had language that didn't necessarily extend the Jones Act requirements to offshore wind farms, although most people took it as though it did. However, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020 clarified the law and confirmed that it applies to installations for exploring or producing non-mineral energy resources, which includes wind. This concept was confirmed by US Customs and Border Protection in a letter ruling on January 27th of this year, which said that a transportation of merchandise from a US port to a location on the Outer Continental Shelf for the development of production of wind energy is covered by the Jones Act and must be conducted on a US flagged ship that is otherwise eligible. Interestingly, there are no United States flag wind turbine installation vessels. One is under construction for Dominion Energy, the Charybdis, and that is being built to both transport and install wind turbines offshore. But the only offshore facility right now that is up and running off of Block Island was built with a non-US jack-up rig that was affixed to the ocean floor and installed the wind turbines by lifting equipment off of feeder vessels that were brought out to it. This installation, provided that it does not involve the transportation of merchandise between US points, is not coastwise trade. And the Coast Guard has indicated that foreign flag wind turbine installation vessels in those circumstances are not engaged in coastwise trade and can be used for the installation of wind turbines. Since the issuance of the January letter ruling by Customs and Border Protection, there have been 2 additional rulings relating to wind turbines by them. On February 4th, the Customs and Border Protection confirmed that foreign flag jack-up vessels may be used to install wind turbines within the jurisdiction of the United States, provided that they don't move merchandise between points. The second one, from March 25th, confirmed when pristine seabed becomes a point within the coastwise trade laws. Generally, it had been understood that a pristine seabed was not a point, and a foreign flag vessel can transport goods from a US port to a pristine seabed without any issues. In January of this year, Customs and Border Protection issued a ruling that said the opposite, but on March 25th, they reversed that and said that until in the first instance, it's scouring protection boulders are dropped onto a pristine seabed, that seabed point is not a point within the jurisdiction of the Jones Act. But as soon as those scouring protection boulders are dropped, we can only use US flag vessels eligible to transport coastwise goods or engage in coastwise trade to that point. The expected growth in the US market for wind turbine installation means that US shipyards are expected to be building several specialized vessels to move merchandise and service these installations when they're established. But there will also be need for expertise in wind farm installation and servicing activities, which, for the most part, is expected to be derived from European experience. Unlike the US, there have been offshore wind facilities in Europe since the early 90s. The only offshore wind farm in the United States was built within the last 5 or 6 years. So this circumstance creates a fertile ground for joint ventures to be established. However, because of the Jones Act, any joint venture between US coastwise operators and foreign investors or joint venturers must be made with an eye toward compliance with the US citizenship requirements. This is a thumbnail of citizenship requirements for Jones Act. I won't get too deep in the weeds, but in order to transport merchandise or passengers between US points, that transport must be done on a vessel registered in the United States flag. That means it also has to be crewed by a US crew. The US flag, which is overseen by the National Vessel Documentation Center, doesn't allow for foreign maritime entities like some other flags to own vessels. So the vessel owner will have to be a company, or could be an individual, but generally it's a company established in the United States or within a state of the United States, like a Delaware LLC or corporation. For a corporation or an LLC that's managed like a corporation by a board, there are, and this is true for all organizations, but there are strict citizenship requirements for employees. The CEO, by any name, has to be a US citizen. The chairman of the board of directors of that company has to be a US citizen. A quorum of the board for decision-making purposes must be US citizens. And this is the big one. At least 75% of the ownership interests must be owned by US citizens, otherwise eligible to operate in the coastwise trade. There is an overarching understanding also within the Jones Act that even if all of these boxes are ticked, there can't be any other contract or understanding by which a majority of the voting power can be exercised directly or indirectly by foreign non-US citizens. And there is no other means by which control of that entity can be given to or permitted to be exercised by a person not a citizen of the United States. Now, this broad language encompasses shareholder agreements that may force US citizens to vote in a way that non-citizens may want them to vote, contracts with third parties, including charters that may give the charterer some strange control over the company that shouldn't otherwise be there, and other commercial arrangements that may give a non-citizen's influence over the company. There are workable structures for joint ventures within the Jones Act space, but with this vague concept of restrictions on control by non-citizens, it's important that the structure be analyzed closely. Both public and private companies operating in the coastwise trade have partial ownership by foreign interests. Often their organizational documents will have provisions directed at compliance with the requirements of coastwise trade laws, such as the citizenship of the CEO and the chairman of the board and the quorum of the board, and mechanisms intended to avoid tripping the citizenship requirements for beneficial owners, like automatically voiding out any transfer that would put non-citizen owners in more than something less than 25% of the ownership. There are structures to dilute somewhat the 75% ownership test. The Coast Guard looks at every level of ownership to apply this 75 US citizen and 25 up to 25 non-US citizen test on companies. A vessel has to be owned by a coastwise person, right? A coastwise entity. That coastwise entity can be 75% owned by another eligible coastwise Jones Act entity that can in turn be 75% owned by another, meaning that at every level, up to 25% could be held by non-US citizens. And that, from a beneficial standpoint, can dilute the US citizen ownership to a certain extent. But the overarching control issues are always present, and there should be no means by which the voting control or other control over the company can be exercised by non-US persons. There is availability of having your structure reviewed by the Coast Guard and MARAD, or proposed structures reviewed by them, and given, if not a stamp of approval, at least a nod. But there is very little publicly available material on the outcome of such reviews because it's usually done privately, whether formally or informally. So the most important takeaway I think I'd like you to get from this is that it is more than likely that joint ventures are going to be the next wave in the United States, and they've begun already, for the development of offshore wind. But because of the Jones Act and the restrictions on the beneficial ownership by non-US citizens, each of those structures must be reviewed very carefully to ensure that the entities don't trip up coastwise trade laws, because the penalties for violation of them are severe, including fines and potentially forfeiture of the vessel. We will be touching upon financing issues in the panel discussion. So I think, especially given the time, it's a good time for me to stop here, and we'll move on to our group discussion.
Dan, Chris, thank you very much. That was indeed very interesting. I think gives a lot of room for thoughts and ideas going forward. So hope your new administration will help a lot of interesting projects to realize. I think now we want to use the few minutes to have a quick discussion on bankability and structuring issues to ensure that you have a project which works. And I'm happy to welcome, along with Dan and Chris, Richard Smith, who is a partner in the finance group and based in London. Richard specializes in asset finance transactions with particular focus on shipping and offshore. He advises banks, financial institutions, ship owners in all aspects of loan and security documents. He also worked in Singapore and has direct experience in industry with owners and operators. So welcome, Richard, to join us. I think you have a bit of first-hand experience. That's why you're in the group. And now to you the question: what are, to your mind, the key differences between a typical traditional ship finance and financing offshore wind construction support vessels, if there are any? Richard, maybe you want to take that first.
Thanks, Christian. Oh, yeah, the offshore wind sector has some nuances given the length of the charter contract. So while an SOV may have a charter of up to around 10 years, the WTIVs will have a charter period of up to around sort of 2-3 years. So the sector has some parallels with the offshore sort of oil and gas sector. And we're seeing financiers viewing transactions sort of more on a project finance basis. So financiers will be looking at the strength and duration of the underlying charter as well as the asset. So this follows through to the financial covenant packages that we're seeing, which are particularly focused on sort of debt service ratios. So the employment of the vessel is having greater focus, and it's not just the asset values. We feel that owners sort of must have a story to tell financiers about the ability of the vessel to move between projects, particularly with the WTIVs where the charter periods are shorter. So I think owners want to demonstrate that they have the ability to win future projects, and that the assets are of a design and quality that will enable them to meet the requirements of the future. So I think owners, given the focus on employment, owners want to be able to demonstrate that they have the flexibility, or the vessel has the flexibility to work in multi-jurisdictions, and that the vessels will be able to compete in the future with newer and likely larger vessels. I think sort of financings for a WTIV are going to be a lot more bespoke and tailored to the employment of the vessel. To deal with a shorter charter period, financiers will look to use tools like cash lockups, sort of step up and step downs based on the employment of the vessels, and possibly sort of requiring higher equity to be put in. Chris,
okay, thanks. Go ahead. Thanks, Richard. Very, very valuable hint. I think, Chris, in the context of the Jones Act, if you look at the same kind of question, what could we differentiate, or what's the same there? So
sure. Well, from the Jones Act standpoint, the vessels that we're talking about being built are not the wind turbine installation vessels, except for this one that's under construction right now. In what I would expect will be the traditional setup, we'll have a foreign vessel, and as Richard said, that would be more of a project issue. The one thing with shipbuilding contracts is that the end user is going to want to make sure that the service vessels, and these will be the ones that are carrying up goods from U.S. ports to the wind turbine installation vessel, which must be built in the United States because they'll be Jones Act vessels, are going to be delivered at the same time and on a schedule with the wind turbine installation vessels, so that they can start the project on a timely basis. From a financing standpoint, in the US, we could, if it's not a project finance covering all vessels as a project, there could be shipbuilding contract finance and traditional mortgage finance of the vessels once they're delivered by the yard. We also, in the US and specifically within the Jones Act, have an exception for leasing companies that allows non-US coastwise companies, and several banks have set up leasing companies that may or may not satisfy the citizenship requirements of the coastwise laws, to own vessels through a sale leaseback structure and charter them back to the Jones Act operator. This is an alternate type of financing that is used in the United States. The leasing company gets the benefit of bonus depreciation fairly quickly on a US asset, and the vessel owner gets quasi financing, and the vessel is off their books. Those are the wrinkles with the Jones Act that would come up.
Well noted. Thanks both to you. And I think we heard a lot about the vessels and its form, different specifics, etc., etc. In a nutshell, who's driving the specification and requirements for these vessels? If you look at the stakeholders, usually around the operation of the vessel.
Yeah, charterers appear to be demanding sort of a very high sort of specification and quality of the vessels. Charterers are wanting sort of state-of-the-art vessels. These sort of charterers sort of have a very high sort of ESG standard. I think the high ESG standard is driven as the vessels form part of the supply chain for renewable energy. They want to be saying that they are using the sort of the cleanest and greenest vessels available to provide the renewable energy. I think it goes to the whole credentials of the project. So I guess so. While the E and sort of ESG seem to take the headlines, we're also seeing charterers expecting sort of good accommodation that will encourage a diverse workforce. So obviously, while this has sort of cost implications for owners in meeting these sort of the specifications and quality, I think it will obviously help them market the vessels in the future and also attract financiers. We are seeing sort of new financiers in this sector who view it as an infrastructure project and that they're helping finance the delivery of sort of a government's promises for green energy.
Okay, and I think, Chris, do you see any big differences? So also the charterers being the driver, or do you see other stakeholders involved?
Well, certainly the charterers / end users will be drivers, and they are likely to be involved, or the owners are likely to want them to be involved in the shipbuilding contract. They may want some oversight at the shipyards to make sure that the vessels are being built in accordance with their specs. And this raises its own issues, but it may actually be helpful to the owners because certainly the end users have the knowledge about the technology. And it's quite possible that their input, hopefully not through change orders, but in creating the specifications for the shipbuilding contracts, will give these vessels a longer useful life because they'll be adaptable for what the end users may see as a developing technology.
Okay, understood. I think I personally learned over the years working on a range of transactions. You better ask your tax advisor before you do anything. So, Dan, as you are covering the tax side of things, are the US tax equity investors concerned with the vessel financing, or what is your experience there?
They're concerned. It's I wouldn't say it's their primary concern, but it's certainly it's their concern in the sense that they're concerned with the entirety of the project, and this is obviously a crucial component of the project. Certainly in the case of the investment tax credit, where you're really front loading your credits, you're front loading your expenses. It's very much in their interest to ensure that everything sticks to its schedule, that the turbines that are expected to be installed are installed when they're installed, that the expenditures are all paid all when expected. And I think one of the differences is if you have the PTC where it's ongoing energy production, a delay of a few months means in the long term you have a delay of your tax benefits, and it slightly decreases your tax profile. But if that means that you get the credits in year 9 versus year 8 to some extent, that may be a relatively minimal hit. On the flip side, if you delay if you expect your credits in year 1 and you get them in year 2, that's 100% delay in your time horizon, and that's huge. So I think the answer is it's certainly important. It's certainly something they look at. It's something that they look at within the context of the entire project as a whole.
Okay, noted. Thank you very much, Dan. I think this very much relates to the employment of the vessel, the charterer, who is obviously driving such a project. I think that could lead to an interesting question on quiet enjoyment rights. So how do you see this differing in the offshore wind space then from a usual quiet enjoyment situation you have?
I think we're going to see some parallels to the offshore and sort of the FSRU sort of projects. So in those projects, it would be common for a lender to the project company to want a direct agreement with any sort of project document counterparties, so that he can mitigate the risk of a termination of any sort of key project documents. So I think we're going to see scenarios where the vessel financiers will need a deed of quiet enjoyment, and the project lenders will require a sort of a direct agreement with the owner, because they don't want the owner to sort of terminate the charter for a breach by the charter and then to take the vessel away from the project. So like the SFRU space, we'll see the development in a sort of a type of agreement which is sort of just a hybrid between sort of shipping finance and project finance, sort of bringing sort of concepts together from the two. Obviously, this has implications for owners. I think it's going to lead to some more sort of time-consuming and complicated negotiations. I think traditional shipping banks may not be familiar with this this sort of tripartite document, but also it is always tricky negotiating with two sets of lenders with slightly different interests.
Chris, do you see anything which differs from the typical quiet enjoyment?
Well, what Richard is describing is a very atypical quiet enjoyment agreement. I mean, the traditional shipping quiet enjoyment agreement is just between two parties. What we foresee is a hopefully not protracted, but at least multi-party negotiation of quiet enjoyment, and considerations that each party will take into account are the intervening parties' potential for dissolution or filing for bankruptcy, right? I mean, the end user wants to be protected. They want to make sure that they have these vessels. If there's anybody in the chain through which they may get them, they want to make sure that they can actually still have access to the ships, while the lenders want to make sure they still have access to an income stream. So I think there will be a lot of parties involved in the negotiation of these quiet enjoyment agreements.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think all the parties may be attracted by what's currently happening there. Are you seeing new lenders interested in these type of vessels, or are the classical ones you see across the board?
I think it's a very exciting time. We're seeing lots of sort of new financiers who are very keen to sort of finance the sector. So sort of infrastructure debt funds, sort of pension funds have been interested. We've seen these types of financiers taking sort of senior positions or junior positions on transactions. There's some sort of flexibility in the role that they're willing to play. Obviously, this creates some challenges because these new financiers are not familiar with the shipping market. So sort of owners and I think both sets of lawyers are having to get these types of financiers comfortable with the shipping transactions and things that we would view as standard. I think so thinking about sort of recent transactions, I think obviously QELs is always a sort of a complicated or topic. I think these financiers aren't familiar with vessel insurances. They haven't seen a refund guarantee from a shipbuilding contract. there's lots of sort of obstacles to sort of get these financiers comfortable, but they are very keen to enter this sector.
Yeah, can imagine. So generally, you touched on the challenges as that. I think so far, very interesting topic, I guess. I think we have now the chance to answer a few questions which came in. I think someone asked a question, which if I understand it correctly, it's meant to cover the term of such a project and referring to a very complex design and how to develop and then build such a vessel, and a fairly short-term interest of wind farm startups, how that could work together. So in the light of the Jones Act, is that something on the term? Are you seeing, Chris, problems in bringing together the time you spent to invest and develop and build such a vessel, and then someone who's just a quick window and is trying it, or is it everyone is long-term interested in it?
Well, this is fairly new what we're doing here. I think there are a lot of slots that are being reserved in the United States to build SOVs for wind turbine installation vessels. The plan, from what I understand, is that these barges or feeder vessels or ATBs or whatever being built, they will be subject to new designs because wind turbines have increased in size exponentially over the past 5 years since the Block Island installation. So they will be specially built. But there are people working on these designs now, and I believe that the U.S. Industry is moving forward to try to build in a timely manner. Installations right now are expected, I believe, to commence in late 2023, maybe 2024, which gives a certain amount of time for these vessels to become up and running. Okay,
good. And the next one just follows, also, of course, more in the finance area. Richard, you touched on it. Someone was asking, how would a financier get comfortable with construction finance, given, and that information is new to me, I have to admit, given a lack of refund guarantees in the US? So
I don't know, I can pass it on to one of the US.
You do not have refund guarantees in the US, Chris? Is that true?
Shipbuilding in the US is a different animal, but I'll just say that shipbuilding contracts do get financed in the US. The vessels that are being built in the US, aside from this one wind turbine installation vessel, are going to, for the most part, going to be much less high ticket items than the installation vessels themselves. And there is a well-established banking of shipbuilding in the US. I don't think there's much to worry about. The other thing is that mortgagees of US vessels don't have to be US entities. Up until I think around the late 60s or early 70s, before I started practicing law, or was even thinking about practicing law, there was a requirement that mortgagees over US flagged ships operating the coastwise trade had to be US entities. That is not the case. Foreign lenders can have mortgages over coastwise trade vessels, but there will be, sorry, somebody just sent me a text. There will be some issues about enforcement. And generally the refund guarantees in the US, to the extent they're given, are done through letters of credit as opposed to what we would consider traditional refund guarantees, which would be bank guarantees. US banks don't give guarantees.
Okay, understood. I think I wasn't aware of that, but that might be some educating requiring for those who have been traditionally active in shipbuilding, but it seems there is an answer. I think you probably answered the next question which came up from the audience, and that was, if you are financing a Jones Act vessel, does that limit the pool of the lender? So I think at least sounds like not really. So at least not legally.
I just answered that. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, no, but I think, but on the other hand, I think on a practical point of view, I think, do you see all the typical banks are open for Jones Act financing?
There are several banks involved in financing Jones Act vessels in the United States. I certainly think that they would have an appetite for financing shipbuilding in the U.S. as well.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. And I think, in terms of sanctions and tax, Daniel, I think that I assume there's not much deviating if you have a Jones Act vessel, right? I think just in terms of
Hopefully, if you're doing everything right, no sanctions issues. If you have sanctions issues, then we're in a whole different world.
Everyone is touching on that topic, and I guess it's definitely something you have to check in any event with you. So that goes without saying. So I think thank you very much to the three of you. It was a very interesting topic, and I think it will remain with us in one or the other occasion in any event. So I think for now we do not have any further questions.
And Alessandro, so I just take that one, the question.
Yeah, you go ahead. I think.
Yes, I think this sort of goes to the quality of the assets. We had sort of a deal that I worked on recently where the junior lender was taking the residual value risk on the vessel at the end of the financing, and was very comfortable given the quality of the asset, what the value of the vessel would be at the end of the charter period, and the charter period was sort of roughly 10 years. They were just so confident that what it would be like in the future. And I think in the second sort of question, we are seeing financiers looking beyond the life of the initial sort of charter period. So currently sort of looking at a transaction where it would extend sort of 5 years beyond the initial charter period.
Okay, understood. I think, do we have any other questions anyone can see?
No, but just for clarification, those two questions that Richard was talking about were about financiers' views on residual value of the vessels. We can see the questions, but I don't know if everybody else.
Yeah, so that's good. Perfect. I think then I conclude with thanking you again. That was number 2 in a series of 3. So I hope you may have time to join us next week, Tuesday at 2 o'clock German time. So we will then speak about ESG and sustainability in the maritime sector with representatives from some shipping companies. So we touched on it briefly in the context of financing in the niche we were talking about today. So I hope everyone has enjoyed the session. I have done so. If anyone of the audience has questions to Dan, to Chris, to Richard, feel of course free to drop them an email. It's online to find. And otherwise, I wish you all a good day. Stay safe and speak soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Christian.
Thank you.
Bye.